So next item on the agenda, item 7, we have a presentation on the Florida Wildlife Corridor Water Benefits Report, presented by Dr. Joshua Daskin from the Archbold Biological Station. And the purpose of this presentation is to inform the committee on a recent report assessing the overlaps between the Florida Wildlife Corridor's geography and the location of key water resources statewide. Connection to the CCNP. This relates to Fish, Wildlife and Habitat Protection Priority Action 3, assisted in assessing and promoting the economic, social and environmental benefits of land protection and habitat restoration. And Dr. Daskin, over to you.
Thank you very much. I will assume you all can hear me fine unless you tell me otherwise. And appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all today. CHNEP is very much an important cooperative group in the area where we work, and you're certainly among the types of groups that we are trying to reach with the report we'll describe today, so I appreciate having the chance to tell you all about it. For those who are not familiar with us, Archbold is primarily a science research facility. We're based in Highlands County in Venus, Florida, just south of Lake Placid. So we are firmly within the heartland of the Coastal and Heartland National Estuary Program area. And we are a science conservation and education facility focused on using science to support the conservation of Florida's lands, water, and wildlife. If you could go to the next slide, I will give you a little outline of what I'm going to cover today. The first thing is going to be a very quick one-slide introduction to the Florida Wildlife Corridor, just for those who maybe haven't caught wind of this effort yet. And so I can give a little big picture, high-level background for what we're talking about the rest of the day. Then I will describe some of the motivation for the Water Resources or Water Benefits Report, and give you a little bit of who's who was involved in producing it and how. Numbers 4 and 5 here are kind of some overview or summary, I guess, of the report, what the report includes and what it doesn't, and some really kind of key take-home messages. Then I'll dive into some details. It is a long report, so certainly not going to cover everything here today, but give you some view of the water resource specific data that are in this report and how it may apply to your work. And then tell you a little bit of some of what's left to do in this research sphere, the intersection of land conservation and water resources. And then, of course, leave time for question and answer and any discussion you all want to have. Next slide, please. All right, so the campaign to conserve the Florida Wildlife Corridor is focused on this geography here. And you can see it's an ambitious, wide-ranging effort to conserve and connect wildlife habitats from the southern tip of the state in the Everglades up to the Okefenokee and Osceola area on the border with Georgia, and then west out to Alabama. The full area covers 18 million acres, and it's about half of the state's land area. The areas in dark green are what we call the conserved lands, and the areas in light green are opportunity areas, areas that are not yet conserved, but that are targeted and that are selected based on a model run by Tom Hochter at the University of Florida. The model is called the Florida Ecological Greenways Network, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And this effort is really a kind of agglomeration of decades of land conservation work in Florida that allow us to have the opportunity for such an ambitious statewide conservation effort. Lots of this conservation work was done before it was ever branded as the Florida Wildlife Corridor, but this connectivity is really important for maintaining wildlife populations, allows them to migrate seasonally in some cases, allows subpopulations to be connected to each other for mating, and allows foraging for food in different types of habitats. So we know really well from a biological perspective, which is, excuse me, my primary background, that connected and conserved large landscapes is really important for those sorts of species that we want to conserve. Panther, bear, you've got swallowtail kite here, coyotes, raccoons, all of these sort of terrestrial wildlife, we understand really well about connectivity. If you can go to the next slide. Thank you. What we know a little bit less about as ecologists, conservation scientists, is what exactly are the impacts of, or the benefits and costs of conserving large landscapes for water resources. So again, a lot of the science of connectivity comes from wildlife ecology, less so from water resources science. That said, in a state that is focusing now pretty heavily on connectivity conservation, there's lots of reasons to want to understand that nexus between wildlife conservation, land conservation, and water. Florida is very much a state that is all about water, as you all know probably better than I do. We have over 50 major rivers, 700 springs, almost 8,000 lakes, and 10 million acres of wetlands. There are over 3 million acres of yet to be protected floodplains alone just within the Florida Wildlife Corridor. And for your geography that you're concerned with, I'm showing here a map of the areas that were flooded during Hurricane Ian. We produced this map with data from the Federal Pacific Northwest National Laboratory shortly after the hurricane to be able to visualize just how intense this flooding was. So it's really critical both for those who are concerned with water resources and those who are going and trying to speak on behalf of the Florida Wildlife Corridor to understand the benefits of land conservation and connectivity for all of wildlife economies, in particular rural economies like ranching and timber, and for water resources that sustain our ecosystems and our human communities. I've got this bullet point here. There's a desire for win-wins. And I think this is really true across the conservation community around the country and around the world right now. There's a lot of talk about co-benefits. So how do you do something that's good for biodiversity and good for climate, good for biodiversity and good for water? And that desire is real, and I'm all for it. But I think we just need to be able to speak from a place of credibility when we're going, for instance, to Tallahassee or to DC or to private funders to seek funding for conservation, whether it's for the Florida Wildlife Corridor, which has been funded at approximately $2 billion in the state of Florida in the last 2 years, or any other conservation initiative, terrestrial, aquatic, marine. We want to be able to speak with authoritative information. So next slide, please. So Archbold is, as I said, focused on the conservation ecology, the conservation education and science for supporting Florida's wildlife, water, and lands. But we're a relatively small organization. We have 7 research labs, and we're fairly terrestrially focused. So when this need for some water resources information became apparent in the campaign for the conservation of the Florida Wildlife Corridor, which we have been a leading science organization on, it became clear that we really had to look outside of Archbold and leverage our scientific network, ask some friends for some help. So we went to the University of Florida's Water Institute, and in particular its director, Dr. Wendy Graham, and said, can you recruit an all-star team of water resources scientists to answer these questions for us? How is water resources affected by this really wide-ranging effort to conserve up to 50% of the state? And Wendy did just that. She did a spectacular job of bringing in, excuse me, a team of really statewide experts on all aspects of water resources, from wetlands to marine ecosystems, water supply, water quality, water for agriculture, water for people. Some ecological aspects, certainly lots of human use aspects as well. So in the who's who here, the folks on the right, Wendy and her team, were very much the authors of this report. Archbold provided some steering and some shaping of the report and sort of all the background necessary about the corridor and the campaign to preserve it. I, along with our cartographer, Angeline Meeks, and our conservation science communicator, Jen Guyton, produced some digested materials at the end of the report. So the full report is 200+ pages, and we put together kind of the science translation materials. So there's a summary report that's about 12 pages long, much more easy to digest. And we've been distributing that to groups like yours, to legislators and their staff, to land trusts, to other nonprofits, and to landowners around the state so that they can start to understand the findings in this report. Next slide, please. Keep going. It should bring up a few more bullet points. Oh, back one. Huh. There should be some items that pull up there, but I can just speak through it. That's all right. So we asked Wendy and her team to do a synthesis of the existing science, not to do new modeling. So we really said, all right, you all are the experts. What can you tell us from the existing literature out there? That's all right. You can stick on the slide and I'll just talk through a couple bullet points. Thank you. To really give us the summary of the state of water resources science and how it overlaps with land conservation. So they were very geographically focused, ended up using a lot of GIS, geographic information systems, and mapping to tell us where in the corridor those opportunity areas, the places that are targeted for conservation, or the conserved areas, those that are already protected, where do they overlap with the locations of known water resources? And I'll give you the list of those resources in a minute. They considered both the area, the volume of area conserved, and also the connectivity, which was much harder for them to sort of find existing answers for. It turns out that connectivity is not something that hydrologists and aquatic ecologists are thinking about the same ways as land or terrestrial ecologists. There are lots of kind of quotable stats and tidbits in this report, which I hope will be useful to groups like yours and to all those that I named before, land trusts, agencies, landowners, for prioritizing and for promoting or advancing efforts to fund conservation of the corridor, both for its wildlife benefits and its water resources benefits. Next slide. All right, so Wendy and her team categorized the benefits provided by the by the corridor to this long list of water resources types as either low, moderate, or good, excellent. So kind of simplified ways to think about this. And if something falls into the low or moderate category, that means that less than 50% of the resources locations are inside the corridor and can be conserved by the corridor. And if it's good to excellent, that means that over 50% falls into that bucket. And the reason they used 50% was not just that it's a nice round number, but as I said, about 50% of the state's land is within the corridor. So if you're overrepresented, you're good to excellent. If you're underrepresented in the corridor, you're low to moderate. So some take-home messages here that statewide, the Florida Wildlife Corridor, for something that was designed for wildlife primarily, it includes an awful lot of water resources. So you can see it does a great job protecting spring vents, freshwater swamps and marshes, river corridors, and river watersheds, as well as estuaries and some coastal resources. That doesn't mean that it's going to solve all of our Florida water resources issues, either locally or statewide. So again, we're trying to speak from a place of credibility here and not overpromise. And this doesn't necessarily mean that we should go and expand the area of the corridor to include all of these other resources. It just means that we're going to need some other sorts of activities, some of which are already in place, like BMAPs or Clean Water Act regulations. Some other activities besides corridor conservation are going to be needed to protect some of those things that fall in the low to moderate category. Next slide, please. Go one more. There we are. So I'll just orient you to some of the maps and graphs I'm going to show. Throughout the report, we used, or Wendy's team used, this color scheme on the right. So again, the dark green is the conserved areas, the light green is the opportunity areas in the corridor, and then the dark brown is other protected areas. So they're not within the Florida Wildlife Corridor, but they are conserved. And then the light tan is areas that are not conserved. So it could be urban areas, could be stuff that's just not in the corridor and not conserved. And that color scheme is then also translated into these bar graphs on the left, where a water resource is shown. Here it's on the top bar, the total watershed area. And we show the proportion of that resource statewide that falls into these four categories. So you can see that 24% of some watershed in this example falls within the opportunity areas, and 27% is in the conserved areas. That's a total of 51%. So this would like just barely make it into that good to excellent category. And the bottom bar shows the total area of Florida for comparison. So you can see it's actually, in this case, quite similar. Next slide. All right, so I'm going to take, I think, the next 5 or 6 slides and give you a little zoomed in look at a couple of water resources so you can see some of the details of how this works in the report. So this is now water quality and water quantity for ecosystems. Flow into rivers, flow into lakes, flow into estuaries. And you can see that again, you have the total watershed area. That's the same example graph that I showed on the previous slide. But then on the right is a map of Aquifer Recharge. And that light blue that's been added to the map is the areas of highest priority aquifer recharge. So the corridor actually doesn't do that great a job at securing groundwater quality and groundwater recharge. So that's one of those things that we're going to need other sources of conservation or other regulatory or voluntary measures, incentives measures to conserve a lot of that area in the Big Bend and up into north central Florida. It's a little hard to see on this map because of the scale, but if you did zoom into the Peace River area, and if you squint here, you can just see that there is some of that light blue. So there's certainly some aquifer recharge value to the CHNEP landscape as well, just not as much as that north central Florida region. Next slide. Public water supply, also not one that's really comprehensively covered by the Florida Wildlife Corridor. So if you look at the statewide total permitted water allocations, about a quarter of that is within the conserved area, within the opportunity areas in that top light green bar. But only 5% is already conserved in the corridor and 8% elsewhere. So you're probably going to need some other metrics, some other measures for conserving it. That's not really too surprising. A lot of our water allocations come from some of the higher and drier areas of the state, again, that overlap with some of those aquifer recharge areas. And those are also areas that are particularly attractive for development, the higher and drier areas. So maybe we need to think a little bit about some non-land conservation types of activities that will conserve water supplies. Next slide. Springs is an interesting one. I mentioned that we have over 700 springs in Florida, and the corridor does a really good job, if you look at the left graphs there on the bottom left, of conserving the actual spring vents, where the water is coming out of the ground, out of the spring into a river or a stream. We have, 74% of the first magnitude, so the largest springs are conserved. But then if you look at the graphs on the right, the outstanding Florida spring sheds, the areas that actually collect water and collect groundwater going into our springs, so much more extensive areas than the vents themselves, we're actually not doing as good a job of conserving those areas. And you can see there's some overlap again with that north central Florida spring sheds area, when you aquifer recharge area, when you look at the spring sheds. Next slide. Lakes, not such a great job in the Florida Wildlife Corridor or statewide. Again, some of these exist in some of the higher, drier portions of the state, and so they've been heavily developed around them. Of 16,000 miles of lake perimeter in the state, less than 1,000 are conserved by the Florida Wildlife Corridor. We could still double the amount that's conserved by adding all of the opportunity areas, and that's a key take-home message here. For just about every water resource, if we were able to conserve all of those opportunity areas, which is ambitious, and we may not get every acre, we probably won't get every acre, but if we did, we could double the conservation of just about every water resource, even the ones that are not so well represented in the corridor. Next slide. All right, wetlands, we're starting to do a little bit better. This is partially driven by the Everglades, of course, but also some of the larger north and northeast sections of the state and the Peace River watershed, where you all focus a lot of your attention. So 44% of wetlands in Florida have been converted to development through history, but of the remaining areas, over 70% of swamps and nearly 80% of marshes, so emergent grassy or graminoid wetlands, are within the Florida Wildlife Corridor. And again, although we're talking about a lot of the Everglades area that's already conserved, there's quite a bit of opportunity to conserve areas still. So the maps in the bottom left here show the percent of a resource that is still available for conservation within a watershed. And we can look, for instance, at the area within the CHNEP. Some of those central west watersheds, they're kind of bright red. So there's, so sorry about that, everybody. The computer gods were not on my side today, I guess, and everything just crashed on me. So hopefully we'll get back through it in about 4 slides to go here. So as I was saying, some of those surface water wetlands are pretty well protected. Swamps and marshes are in the 70 to 80% range for what's totally included in the corridor. But you can still see in those light green bars, there's quite a bit of opportunity area that would conserve large portions of these resources still. And if you look at the maps in the bottom left here, it shows 4 specific watersheds, including the ones where you all work, the proportion of each of these resources that is available still to conserve in the in each watershed in the opportunity areas. So for the CHNEP region, it looks like sort of there's more to be conserved, both in terms of emergent wetlands or marshes and forested wetlands or swamps in the the eastern parts of your region than in the western parts of your region. Next slide. Rivers and streams, like those surface water wetlands, do pretty well in the corridor, and that's not real surprising. The modeling that's used to find connected landscapes for wildlife is somewhat focused on river courses, in part because we've done a pretty good job of conserving them in the past in Florida, and in part because lots of wildlife will actually use those river courses and the riparian vegetation alongside them to help move throughout the landscape. So 62% of the length of Florida's major rivers flow through the wildlife corridor, and there is opportunity to conserve a lot of riparian floodplains. I mentioned at the start, and I'll say it again, about 3 million acres worth of floodplains statewide that are undeveloped and that are within those opportunity areas. So coming out of course, all the tragedy of Hurricane Ian, it's something to keep in mind that the more we can conserve those floodplains, the more they'll be able to do their job of absorbing the water in high rainfall events, in flooding events, and the less will expose new infrastructure to potential insurance claims or damages. Next slide. Estuaries, again, like some of these surface water wetlands and rivers, do pretty well, and a lot of that is really because of historic conservation of coastal areas. So you can see, for instance, the second bar down here, estuarine wetlands statewide, a quarter of them are actually conserved outside the corridor. So those are some coastal preserves. About half of them are already conserved in the corridor, and there's very little left to conserve in the opportunity areas, which are biased inlands, certainly. Fragile coastal upland ecosystems, also lots conserved already, not a lot remaining to be conserved in the corridor, although some coastal areas, that remaining 25% in the second bar from the bottom, that could be conserved elsewhere. So again, the corridor has lots of good things going for it. We definitely don't mean to present it as a be-all, end-all, or the only conservation priority. Next slide. All right, so just to wrap up, some things that were learned in the process of doing this report were that new science, as opposed to these sorts of summaries of the existing state of the science, would really help with understanding water resources and connectivity. We don't know very much about how important it is to have conserved connected lands, for instance, for groundwater recharge. Does it matter if you have 10 acres in the north separated by something developed and then 10 acres in the south? Not something that a lot of hydrologists had already thought of or spent a lot of time studying, at least, in what we learned from this expert panel. Climate impacts to various resources, number 3 here. We're going to be following up on this report. We've contracted a new report to a group led by Colin Polsky and John Baldwin, or Jay Baldwin he goes by, at Florida Atlantic University in their Environmental Studies Center. They're going to be looking very similarly at how does conserved and connected land in the Florida Wildlife Corridor and beyond affect Florida's climate resilience. So they'll be looking not only at water aspects of climate resilience, but also at economics, agriculture, human health, wildlife, the whole suite of resources that we'd like to protect, both through the corridor and again through other activities, to understand how far will conserving the corridor get us. They've convened a second expert panel, about 15 folks from academic, as well as for-profit and nonprofit organizations who've started looking at these questions. And we anticipate having that report in late February, and would be happy to come and share that with you all in the spring if you'd like. The degree of certain processes was also harder to figure out than just the actual geographies. So this report, as I mentioned and as I've shown, has been very focused on the spatial location of the corridor versus the spatial location of things like Aquifer Recharge or a river or a lake. But some of the processes that we're interested in conserving, like nutrient retention, nutrient turnover, carbon sequestration, those are a little bit harder to study than just the location of a known feature. And then finally, the authors of the report felt, and I really would echo, that studying the relative impact of land protection versus land management is going to be important. So a lot of the focus of the corridor is and will still be on funding and completing land conservation. So making sure that some of those opportunity areas are not developed. But once any of these areas are conserved, and hopefully beforehand as well, we need to have good land management activities, fire in particular, invasive plant management in particular, invasive animal management as well, in order to keep those conserved lands providing the resources, whether water or wildlife or economic, that we're interested in having from those conserved areas. So I will stop there and apologize again for the difficulties. You can go to the next slide. Thank you for sticking with us, and happy to take any questions, and anyone is welcome to shoot me an email there with questions that you don't get to today, or I'm happy to send you all the report and the summary.
Anyone got any questions for Dr. Daskin?
I'll start. Josh, this is Jennifer from CHNEP. I was thinking when you said that the report for the climate resilience analysis will be ready in late February, that we have our Southwest Florida Climate Summit February 28th and 29th already scheduled.
Yep.
So if you think that could work, I would encourage you and your colleagues to put an abstract in, which is open right now on our website, for the climate summit, so that you would be able to have an opportunity to share there the results of your report.
That's a great suggestion. I'm going to talk about it with the climate report authors, Colin and Jay, and I suspect we may well put in an abstract. Thank you.
David?
Hi, I have a question. Maybe
Could you just tell me who's speaking since I'm not in the room?
Pardon?
Oh,
David Seeley. I'm an ecologist here in Lee County. Anyway, this is maybe not a question for you, but maybe the wildlife corridor folks that are leading the initiative to acquire lands under conservation easements. But because you mentioned, control of exotics, both plant and animal, and I think that's a really critical point. And I'm wondering what are the conditions of these conservation easements? For example, there's a family I know that had 1,400 acres of ranch land that was conserved, and they were given a check of $3 million to continue doing what they're doing. But I wonder what the conditions are of that. Are there requirements for prescribed fire, for the invasive plant control, for removal of feral hogs, that kind of thing?
Sure. Could you just say, is that 1,400 acres and $3 million you're talking about? That's a conservation easement, am I right?
Yes.
Okay. So I can speak to that a little bit, both from the perspective of how some of these state easement programs work and from the land management perspective. So part of my responsibility at Archbold, in addition to a lot of the science translation for the corridor campaign, is overseeing our land management, so fire and invasive species here as well. So the two biggest state programs that have been taking down acreage or conserving areas in the Florida Wildlife Corridor opportunity areas are the same two that have been operating for decades. So again, it's sort of a rebranding of a lot of really good efforts that folks have been doing at the state level for a long time. And those programs are Department of Environmental Protection's Florida Forever program and the Rural and Family Lands Protection program in the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. Both of them are entirely willing landowner programs. So someone has to come and say, I am interested in selling a conservation easement on my lands, or in selling, in the case of Florida Forever, selling the lands outright to the state. And then if you sell outright, it becomes either a Florida Park Service lands, Florida Forest Service, FWC, Fish and Wildlife Commission lands, or some other smaller ones in some cases. But in the easement case that you're asking about, there will be a specific real estate instrument drawn up for the particular parcel. It restricts development, and then the Florida Forever program easements tend to be more restrictive than the RFLPP FDAX easements. The FDAX easements are more agriculture focused, and so it really depends on the individual agreement on the FDAX easements, is my understanding, whether you can convert, for instance, from ranching to citrus or from timber to watermelons. That's something that the individual landowner would negotiate. There are provisions within a lot of these RFLPP FDAX easements for what's called significant natural areas, and those are designated at the time of the easement as particularly important for wildlife and other ecological aspects. And in the past, those have not been allowed to be converted. Florida Forever has been historically focused more on the natural areas, large biodiverse parcels. Certainly can and does include agriculture in some cases, but mostly ranching and timber. Some of the lower intensity types of agriculture in the corridor and that are more wildlife friendly than some of the more intensive agricultural uses like row crops or citrus or sugarcane. As for whether there's a land management provision in any of these easements, I think the answer is usually not. Usually not in a very specific way. People are being paid for the development rights, and I haven't managed one of these easements myself, so I won't say that there's no language on land management, but there is not a specific provision saying you must burn it in a certain number of years, you must do X number of acres of old world climbing fern management or Kogan grass management. So they don't go into the specifics there. There may be language, and I say maybe because I'm going to hedge, since it's the real estate end is not quite my forte. There may be language about you have to kind of keep it in the same quality as when the easement goes in, but I'm not even going to promise that.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Daskin. If anyone else has any other questions, I believe we have, we do. We have Dr. Daskin's email up there. Maybe you can get in touch with him. Thank you again for the presentation, and thank you for standing by and coming back to us.
Yep, sorry about that. Thank you for having me.